The silence. After the first thing Sarah noticed wasn't the blood or the torn fabric scattered across the pine needles. It was the silence. After 26 years of life, she had never heard a quiet so complete, so wrong. Even the wind had stopped moving through the aspens, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. She sat against the rough bark of a lodgepole pine, her sleeping bag pulled tight around her shoulders despite the July heat. 3 hours had passed since the rescue helicopter had lifted off, carrying what remained of her camping group back to civilization. All except her. She had refused to go. "I need more time," she had told the EMT, a young man whose hand shook as he tried to clean the scratches on her arms. "Please, just a few more minutes." But minutes had become hours, and now the sun was beginning its descent behind the continental divide, casting long shadows across what had been, just that morning, their perfect campsite beside Willow Creek. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the trauma counselor who had arrived with the second wave of emergency responders, approached carefully. Her hiking boots made soft sounds against the forest floor, deliberate, measured steps that announced her presence without startling. "Sarah, I'm Dr. Vasquez. The rangers asked me to check on you." Sarah didn't look up from her hands, which she'd been staring at for the better part of an hour. They looked normal, clean even. It seemed impossible. "How are the others?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. Dr. Vasquez settled onto a fallen log about 6 feet away, close enough to speak quietly but far enough to respect Sarah's space. "Marcus is in surgery. The doctors are optimistic. Jessica has a concussion and some lacerations, but she's stable. David ... She paused. "David is struggling with what he witnessed, but he's physically unharmed." Sarah nodded slowly. 3 survivors out of 7. It could have been worse. Should have been worse. "Can you tell me what you remember?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had been asked this same question by the rangers, by the EMTs, by the sheriff's deputy who had driven up the mountain despite the rough terrain. Each time, the answer felt more impossible to voice. "We followed all the rules," Sarah said finally. "We hung the food properly. We kept the campsite clean. We made noise on the trails." She looked up at Dr. Vasquez for the first time. "We did everything right." Dr. Vasquez nodded. "I believe you. Sometimes, even when we do everything right, nature reminds us that we're visitors in someone else's home." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "That's what Mike used to say. We're just visitors here." Her voice caught on his name. Mike Brennan had been the one to suggest this trip. A geology graduate student at CU Boulder, he'd spent 2 summers working as a backcountry guide and knew the Pike National Forest better than anyone in their group. He'd picked this site specifically, remote enough to feel like true wilderness, but close enough to a marked trail that help could reach them if needed. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Tell me about last night," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "before you went to sleep." Sarah closed her eyes, and immediately she was back there. The campfire crackling, sending sparks up toward a canopy of stars so bright they seemed artificial. Amy had brought her guitar, and they'd sung old camp songs and laughed at how terrible they sounded. Jessica had roasted marshmallows until they were black on the outside and molten inside, exactly the way she liked them. David had told ghost stories that were more silly than scary, making exaggerated faces in the firelight. It had been perfect. The kind of perfect that you know even while it's happening, the kind you try to memorize because you understand it won't last forever. But she hadn't expected forever to end at 3:17 a.m. "We went to bed around 11, Sarah said. "Mike made sure the fire was completely out. We double-checked the food hang. Everything was secured." She pulled the sleeping bag tighter. "I remember lying in my tent, listening to the creek. Amy was already snoring in the tent next to mine. She always snored when she slept outside. I thought it was funny. Dr. Vasquez waited patiently as Sarah gathered herself. I woke up to Jessica screaming. The memory came in fragments, like a film reel with missing pieces. Sarah remembered the sound of tearing fabric, the strange huffing noise that seemed too large to come from any creature she'd ever imagined. The beam of a flashlight sweeping wildly across the tent walls, creating moving shadows that made everything look like a nightmare. I couldn't move at first, Sarah continued. I just lay there listening to Jessica screaming Mike's name over and over. Then I heard David shouting for everyone to get to the trees. But some of the tents... She shook her head. Some of them couldn't. Dr. Vasquez made a note on her clipboard, but didn't interrupt. The thing I keep thinking about, Sarah said, is how quiet it got afterward. Like, 1 minute there was all this chaos and noise, and then suddenly it was just nothing. Even Jessica stopped screaming. We all just sat there in the dark, waiting. Waiting for what? I don't know. For it to come back, maybe, or for someone to tell us it was over. Sarah looked around the campsite, taking in the yellow crime scene tape that fluttered between the trees like twisted birthday streamers. I guess we're still waiting. The rescue had come at dawn, alerted by David's satellite communicator. Sarah remembered the sound of helicopters approaching, the voices of rangers calling their names through the trees. She remembered the relief of seeing other human beings, of knowing they weren't alone anymore. But she also remembered the looks on the rescuers' faces when they saw the campsite. Ranger Patricia Henley, a 20-year veteran of the Forest Service, had been the first to reach them. Sarah watched her now, standing at the edge of the clearing, talking quietly into her radio. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the tension in the woman's shoulders, the way she kept glancing back toward the tree line. Ranger Henley seems concerned, Sarah observed. Dr. Vasquez followed her gaze. She's responsible for public safety in this area. An incident like this, it raises a lot of questions. Questions about what we did wrong. Questions about whether this area should remain open to camping. Questions about whether there were warning signs that were missed. Questions about what could have been done differently. Dr. Vasquez met Sarah's eyes. Not questions about blame, Sarah. Questions about prevention. But Sarah knew better. She'd already seen the doubt in some of the responders' eyes, the unspoken questions about their experience level, their preparedness, their decision-making. 7 college students camping alone in grizzly territory. To some people, the tragedy would seem inevitable, even deserved. We weren't inexperienced, Sarah said, as if Dr. Vasquez had voiced the criticism. Mike had been guiding for 2 years. Jessica grew up camping with her family in Yellowstone. David's an Eagle Scout. We knew what we were doing. I'm sure you did. Sometimes knowing what you're doing isn't enough. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Ranger Henley was walking toward them, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to transport you down to the trailhead soon. It'll be dark in a few hours, and we don't want to navigate that terrain after sunset. Sarah nodded but didn't move. Can I ask you something first? Of course. Have you ever seen anything like this before? Ranger Henley was quiet for a long moment. In 20 years of working backcountry, I've responded to 3 bear incidents. 2 were day hikers who surprised a sow with cubs. Minor injuries, mostly defensive wounds. The 3rd was a camper who left food in his tent. She paused. This is different. Different how? The behavior pattern doesn't match what we typically see with defensive encounters or food conditioning. The attack was, she seemed to struggle for the right words. Prolonged. Systematic. We're bringing in a wildlife behaviorist from Colorado State to help with the investigation. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Investigation. We need to understand what happened here, Sarah. for public safety and to help prevent future incidents. That means documenting everything, analyzing the evidence, interviewing the survivors. Ranger Henley's voice was kind but firm. I know this is difficult, but we'll need you to walk us through the events when you're ready. The thought of reliving those hours in detail, of describing the sounds and the fear and the terrible waiting, made Sarah feel nauseous, but she understood the necessity. What happens to the bear? It was the question she'd been afraid to ask, but it hung over everything else. Somewhere in the forest around them, the animal responsible for the attack was still moving through the trees, still foraging and sleeping and living its life. If we can identify and locate the individual animal, it will be euthanized, Ranger Henley said. That's standard protocol for bears involved in fatal attacks. Sarah expected to feel satisfaction at this news, or at least a sense of justice. Instead, she felt only a deep, complicated sadness. The bear hadn't chosen to encounter them any more than they had chosen to encounter it. But choice, she was learning, mattered less than consequence. Dr. Vasquez stood and shouldered her pack. Sarah, are you ready to head down? Your parents are waiting at the hospital, and I think you'd benefit from seeing them. The mention of her parents brought tears to Sarah's eyes for the first time since the rescue. She thought of her mother, who had never wanted her to go on this trip, and her father, who had insisted she was old enough to make her own choices. They would both blame themselves now, in different ways. Just one more minute, Sarah said. She stood slowly, her legs stiff from sitting motionless for so long, and walked to the center of the campsite. The ground was scuffed and torn, pine needles scattered in patterns that told a story she didn't want to read. But she owed it to the others, to Mike and Amy and Carson, to bear witness to this place, to remember it not as it had been in those perfect evening hours, but as it was now. I'm sorry, she whispered to the forest, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to her friends, or to the bear, or to some larger force that governed the brutal mathematics of survival. The trees offered no response, but Sarah thought she felt something shift in the air around her. A release, maybe, or an acknowledgement. Permission to leave. She turned back to Dr. Vasquez and Ranger Henley, who were waiting patiently by the trail marker. Okay, she said, I'm ready. As they began the descent toward the trailhead, Sarah looked back once at the campsite. In a few weeks, after the investigation was complete, the yellow tape would come down. Rain would wash away the last traces of what had happened here. New visitors would arrive, set up their tents in the same clearings, hang their food from the same branches. Life would continue, indifferent to the small human tragedy that had played out among the aspens. But Sarah would carry this place with her forever, not just the horror of what had happened, but the beauty of what had come before. The sound of her friends laughing around the campfire, the way the stars had looked through the tent fly, the feeling of being young and adventurous and completely alive in the wilderness they had loved enough to visit and unlucky enough to survive. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a different kind of wilderness. Dr. Chen's office in downtown Boulder was all warm wood and soft lighting, designed to feel safe and enclosed. Through the window, she could see the Flatirons rising in the distance, but the view didn't trigger the panic attacks it once had. How are you sleeping? Dr. Chen asked. Better. Still not great, but better. Sarah tucked her legs underneath her in the familiar chair. I made it through the night twice this week without waking up. It was progress. For the first month after the attack, Sarah had averaged 2 hours of sleep per night, jerking awake at every sound. Her parents had moved her back into her childhood bedroom and taken turns sitting up with her. But even their presence couldn't quiet the hypervigilance that kept her nervous system in constant alert mode. Any dreams you remember? Sarah hesitated. She'd been having the same dream for weeks, but hadn't told anyone about it. In the dream, she was back at the campsite, but it was exactly as it had been that first perfect evening. Mike was tuning Amy's guitar. Jessica was poking at the fire with a stick. David was setting up his camera for night photography. Carson was reading a book by headlamp. In the dream, Sarah knew what was coming. She tried to warn them, tried to get them to pack up and leave, but no matter how urgently she spoke, they couldn't hear her. They just kept laughing and talking and existing in that moment before everything changed. The worst part wasn't the fear in the dream. It was the joy. Watching her friends happy and whole and unaware of what was coming, Sarah often woke up not with terror, but with a crushing sense of loss for that last perfect evening. "Sometimes I dream that we're all still there," she said finally, "before everything happened. And I want to warn them, but I also want it to stay that way forever." Dr. Chen nodded. Trauma dreams often involve this kind of temporal confusion. Part of your mind wants to fix the past, and part of it wants to preserve the good memories before they were contaminated by what came after. Is that normal? It's completely normal, and it's part of why survivors' guilt can be so persistent. You're not just grieving for your friends, you're grieving for the version of yourself that existed before the trauma. Sarah had never thought of it that way before, but it felt true. The Sarah who had hiked into the Pike National Forest that July morning felt like a different person entirely. That Sarah had believed, on some fundamental level, that bad things happened to other people, that following the rules would keep her safe, that the wilderness was a playground rather than a battleground. "I've been thinking about going back," Sarah said. Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tension around her eyes. "Back to camping. Back to the site. I know it sounds crazy, but I keep feeling like I left something there." Sarah struggled to articulate the pull she'd been feeling, not literally, but like there's some kind of unfinished business. "What do you think you left there?" "I don't know. Maybe my ability to be in the wilderness without being terrified. Mike always said that if you get injured in a particular place, you should go back there as soon as you're healed, or you'll develop a phobia." This wasn't just an injury, Sarah, and you didn't get hurt falling off your bike or stumbling on a trail. This was a life-threatening trauma that resulted in the deaths of people you cared about. Sarah knew Dr. Chen was right, but the pull remained. She'd driven past the turnoff for the Pike National Forest twice in the past month, slowing down both times before ultimately continuing toward Boulder. Each time, she'd felt like a coward. "David went back," she said. Dr. Chen looked surprised. "Recently. Last week. He didn't tell Jessica or Marcus. I think he was afraid they'd try to stop him. But he needed to see it." David Huang had been the most visibly shaken of the survivors in the immediate aftermath. A computer science major who spent most of his free time indoors, he'd joined the camping trip reluctantly, and only because Amy had convinced him it would be good for his anxiety. The irony of that persuasion wasn't lost on any of them. But in the months since, David had surprised everyone with his resilience. He'd returned to his classes within a week, started seeing a counselor immediately, and had even begun planning solo day hikes in less remote areas. How did it go for him? He said it was hard but necessary, like facing your fear of flying by getting back on a plane. Sarah paused. He also said the site looked completely different. The Forest Service had cleaned up all the evidence, and there were no signs anything had ever happened there. How did that make him feel? Relieved mostly, but also kind of sad, like even the place itself had moved on. Dr. Chen made a note on her pad. "If you do decide to go back, I'd recommend taking someone with you, not necessarily to the exact site, but at least into that area of the forest. And I'd want to prepare extensively beforehand. Relaxation techniques, grounding exercises, a clear plan for what to do if you become overwhelmed." The fact that Dr. Chen wasn't immediately dismissing the idea surprised Sarah. You think it might actually be helpful? For some trauma survivors, controlled exposure to the site of their trauma can be part of the healing process. But it has to be done carefully when you're ready and with proper support. She met Sarah's eyes. The question is whether you're considering this because you genuinely feel ready to face that place, or because you feel like you should be ready. It was a good question, and Sarah didn't have a clear answer. Part of her motivation definitely came from guilt, the feeling that she was dishonoring her friend's memory by being afraid of the place where they'd died. But there was something else too, a sense that the story wasn't complete until she could return to the forest without terror. I need to think about it more, Sarah said. That's wise. There's no timeline for healing, Sarah. No schedule you need to follow. After the session, Sarah drove home through downtown Boulder, past the campus where she and her friends had spent the last 4 years of their lives. The University of Colorado felt both familiar and strange now, like a place she'd visited long ago rather than the center of her world. She'd taken a leave of absence for the fall semester, officially for medical reasons, but really because the thought of sitting in lecture halls and pretending to care about coursework felt impossible. Her professors had been understanding, her parents supportive, her remaining friends encouraging. But Sarah knew that every day she spent away from her normal life made it harder to imagine going back. At home, she found a package waiting on her doorstep. Her name was written in familiar handwriting, and her heart clenched when she recognized Jessica's distinctive loops and flourishes. Inside was a photo album filled with pictures from their various adventures over the past 4 years. Jessica had always been the group photographer, documenting their road trips and hiking excursions with the dedication of a professional archivist. Sarah flipped through pages of memories, spring break in Utah, where they'd hiked in Arches National Park, a weekend camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park the previous summer, day hikes around Boulder, climbing trips to El Dorado Canyon, snowshoeing excursions in the winter. The last photo in the album was from their final camping trip, the one Jessica had taken just as the sun was setting on their first evening. All 7 of them were gathered around the campfire, faces illuminated by the orange glow. Mike had his arm around Amy's shoulders. Carson was mid-laugh at something David had said. Sarah was looking directly into the camera, smiling with the kind of unself-conscious happiness that felt now like a relic from another lifetime. Tucked into the back of the album was a letter. Sarah. I've been going through my photos from college and I kept coming back to these. I know it might be hard to look at them right now, but I wanted you to have copies of the good times. For a while, I was afraid that what happened would contaminate all our other memories, but looking through these pictures reminded me that we had 4 amazing years together. The tragedy doesn't erase any of that. I'm planning to transfer to a school closer to home for spring semester. I know my parents think I'm running away, but I need a fresh start somewhere that doesn't have so many reminders. I hope you understand. I love you, and I'm proud of how strong you've been through all of this. Mike would be proud too. They all would. Take care of yourself. Love. Jess. Sarah held the letter for a long time, reading it twice. Jessica transferring felt like another loss, another piece of their shared life that was being dismantled, but she understood the impulse. Sometimes healing required distance, required building a new life in a place that hadn't been touched by trauma. That night, Sarah dreamed again of the campsite. But this time, instead of trying to warn her friends about what was coming, she simply sat with them around the fire and listened to their voices. She woke up not with panic, but with a profound sense of gratitude for having known them at all. 6 months after the attack, Sarah finally returned to the Pike National Forest. She didn't go alone. David had offered to accompany her, and Dr. Chen had insisted on being present as well. They met at the trailhead on a crisp October morning. the aspens blazing gold against the dark green of the pines. Sarah had prepared extensively for this moment. She'd practiced breathing exercises, visualization techniques, and mindfulness meditation. She'd written letters to each of her friends that she planned to leave at the site. She'd even brought sage to burn, a ritual she'd never attempted before, but that felt appropriate somehow. But nothing had prepared her for how different the forest would feel. The trail that had seemed so familiar in July now felt foreign. The changing season accounted for some of the difference. The wildflowers had gone to seed, the undergrowth had died back, the air carried the scent of decomposing leaves rather than summer growth. But there was something else too. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every movement in her peripheral vision. "How are you doing?" Dr. Chen asked when they stopped to rest halfway to the campsite. "Scared," Sarah admitted, "but not the kind of scared I expected." "What do you mean?" "I thought I'd be terrified of seeing the place again, of remembering what happened there. But mostly, I'm scared that I won't feel anything, that it'll just be another clearing in the forest, and that will somehow make everything that happened there seem less real." David nodded. "I know exactly what you mean. When I went back, I kept looking for some sign, some evidence that something significant had happened there. But the forest had already reclaimed it." They continued hiking in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah noticed that she was hyper-vigilant, but not panicked. Her nervous system was on high alert, but she felt grounded in her body and present in the moment. The months of therapy had taught her to recognize the difference between healthy caution and trauma response. When they reached the turnoff for the campsite, Sarah stopped. A new sign had been installed. "Bear activity area. Use caution. No overnight camping." Below it, in smaller text, "In memory of Michael Brennan, Amy Chen, and Carson Williams." Sarah hadn't expected the memorial plaque, and the sight of her friends' names carved into metal made her chest tight with emotion. Someone, probably the Forest Service in consultation with the families, had decided that this place should be marked, that the lives lost here should be remembered. "Take your time, Doctor," Chen said gently. Sarah approached the memorial slowly, running her fingers over the engraved letters. The plaque was simple, dignified, permanent. It said that these lives had mattered, that their deaths had meaning, that they wouldn't be forgotten by strangers who might pass this way in years to come. The campsite itself was barely recognizable. The Forest Service had done extensive rehabilitation work, removing damaged trees and replanting areas where the soil had been disturbed. New growth had already begun to fill in the gaps. In another year or two, there would be no visible signs of what had transpired here. Sarah found the spot where her tent had been and sat down. The letters she'd brought felt heavy in her backpack, but she wasn't ready to read them yet. Instead, she just breathed and listened to the sounds of the forest. A chipmunk scurried across her field of vision, busy with its preparations for winter. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of Willow Creek, still flowing its ancient path toward the valley below. This was still the place she had loved, still the wilderness that had called to her and her friends, with its promise of adventure and beauty and escape from the complications of civilization. The tragedy hadn't changed the essential nature of this place any more than it had changed the essential nature of her memories. "I used to think the wilderness was separate from the rest of life," Sarah said, speaking mostly to herself, but knowing that David and Dr. Chen could hear her, like it was this pure space where only good things happened if you were careful and respectful enough. But it's not separate at all. It's just life, concentrated. All the beauty and all the danger and all the randomness that exists everywhere else. She pulled out the letters she'd written to her friends and read them aloud, one by one. She told Mike that she was sorry they'd never get to explore all the places he'd marked on his maps. She told Amy that she'd been learning to play guitar and thought of her every time she attempted one of the songs they'd sung around the campfire. She told Carson that she'd read all the books he'd recommended and that she finally understood why he loved Kurt Vonnegut so much. When she was finished, she dug a small hole at the base of the memorial sign and buried the letters along with a handful of sage. It felt like the completion of something, not closure exactly, but acknowledgement. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look around the campsite. She would probably never come back here again, but she no longer felt like she was running away. She was simply moving forward, carrying her memories of this place and her friends with her, but no longer trapped by them. The hike out felt different than the hike in. Sarah found herself noticing details she'd missed on the way up, the pattern of lichen on a boulder, the way the afternoon light fell through the canopy, the resilience of new growth pushing up through the forest floor. She felt present in her body in a way she hadn't for months. At the trailhead, she hugged David goodbye and thanked Dr. Chen for making the journey with her. Driving home, she thought about Jessica's letter and her decision to transfer schools. Sarah understood now that there were many ways to heal from trauma, many paths forward. Some led back to the source of the wound, some led away from it, but all were valid as long as they were chosen consciously rather than driven by fear. That evening, she called the registrar's office at CU and re-enrolled for the spring semester. She wasn't sure she was ready, but she was ready to try. And sometimes she had learned being ready to try was enough. 2 years later, Sarah graduated with her degree in environmental science. At the commencement ceremony, she thought about the path that had led her to that major, how the attack had initially made her want to avoid the natural world entirely, but had ultimately deepened her commitment to understanding and protecting it. She'd spent her senior year working on a research project about human-wildlife conflict resolution, interviewing survivors of bear and mountain lion attacks throughout the West. The work was difficult but meaningful, and it had connected her with a community of people who understood that loving the wilderness meant accepting its dangers as well as its gifts. The night before graduation, she drove up to a spot overlooking Boulder, where she could see the mountains. She'd developed a ritual over the past year of coming here. Whenever she needed to feel connected to her friends, she would sit in her car and remember their voices, their laughter, their dreams for the future that would never be realized. But tonight, instead of sadness, she felt something like peace. Mike and Amy and Carson would always be part of her story, but they were no longer the ending of it. She had learned to carry her love for them forward rather than being imprisoned by her grief for them. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, who was finishing his own degree at MIT. "Proud of you. They would be too." Sarah smiled and typed back, "See you at graduation tomorrow. Thanks for walking through hell with me." "Any time," came the reply. "That's what survivors do for each other." Sarah looked out at the mountains one more time, their peaks visible against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow, she would walk across a stage and receive her diploma. Next month, she would start a job with the Forest Service, working on wilderness education and safety programs. Someday, she might even return to backcountry camping, though she would never again assume that following the rules guaranteed safety. She had learned that survival wasn't just about making it through the immediate crisis. It was about figuring out how to build a meaningful life in the aftermath, how to honor what was lost while still embracing what remained. It was about finding ways to transform trauma into wisdom, fear into respect, and grief into gratitude for having loved at all. The wilderness had taken 3 of her dearest friends, but it had also given her a depth of understanding about life and death and resilience that she could never have gained any other way. She would spend the rest of her life trying to help others navigate that same terrible, beautiful complexity. As she drove home through the sleeping city, Sarah felt her friends' presence not as ghosts haunting her past, but as guides pointing toward her future. The silence after the tragedy had been devastating, but she had learned to fill it with purpose, with connection, with the ongoing work of healing and hope. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. The next stories, The Last Light of Kodiak Drive. Sarah Chen adjusted her field glasses for the third time in 10 minutes, scanning the tree line that bordered the salmon spawning grounds along Karluk River. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Alaskan wilderness, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold that would have taken her breath away under different circumstances. But today, September 15th, she wasn't here for the scenery. As the lead wildlife biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Sarah had received troubling reports from local fishing guides about unusual bear behavior in the area, and she'd assembled a small research team to investigate what might be causing the aggressive encounters that had been reported with increasing frequency over the past month. The team had arrived at Kodiak Island 3 days earlier aboard a chartered floatplane piloted by Marcus "Mac" Sullivan, a weathered bush pilot in his early 50s whose intimate knowledge of Alaska's remote waterways had made him the go-to transportation for researchers, hunters and adventurers seeking access to the island's most isolated regions. Mac's weathered Cessna 185 had touched down on the glassy surface of Karluk Lake at precisely 2:15 in the afternoon on September 12th. And since then, the 5-person research team had established their base camp on an elevated gravel bar approximately 200 yards from the main salmon run, positioning themselves with clear sight lines to observe bear feeding patterns while maintaining what they believed to be a safe distance from the animals. Sarah's team consisted of carefully selected specialists, each bringing unique expertise to what she hoped would be a straightforward data collection mission. Dr. James Mitchell, a bear behavior specialist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had spent the better part of 2 decades studying brown bear social dynamics and feeding patterns throughout the state. At 43, James possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of ursine behavior that had made him the lead consultant on numerous human-bear conflict cases, and his presence on this expedition provided Sarah with confidence that they could identify and document whatever factors might be driving the recent aggressive encounters. James had arrived at their departure point in Anchorage, carrying 2 large cases of specialized equipment, including motion-activated trail cameras, audio recording devices capable of capturing bear vocalizations across multiple frequency ranges, and a collection of reference materials that he'd accumulated during his extensive field research. The team's photographer and videographer was Rebecca Torres, a 29-year-old freelance wildlife photographer whose stunning images of Alaska's megafauna had appeared in National Geographic, Outdoor Photography, and numerous conservation publications. Rebecca had responded to Sarah's recruitment call with immediate enthusiasm, seeing the opportunity to document brown bear behavior during the peak salmon run as invaluable for her ongoing project chronicling the intersection of wildlife and human activity in Alaska's rapidly changing landscape. Her camera equipment alone had required its own cargo container for the flight to Kodiak, including professional-grade telephoto lenses, waterproof housing systems, and backup batteries sufficient to power her equipment for extended periods in the field. Rebecca's experience photographing dangerous wildlife had taught her to maintain appropriate distances while capturing the intimate behavioral moments that made her work so compelling, and Sarah valued her understanding of both the artistic and scientific aspects of wildlife documentation. The 4th team member was David Park, a graduate student in wildlife ecology at Colorado State University, who had specifically requested the opportunity to participate in Sarah's research as part of his dissertation work on human-wildlife conflict in subarctic environments. At 26, David brought youthful energy and enthusiasm to the project, along with advanced training in data analysis and field research methodology that complemented the more experienced team members' expertise. David had spent the previous summer conducting preliminary research in Yellowstone National Park, studying grizzly bear feeding behavior around thermal features, and he was eager to expand his understanding of brown bear ecology in the unique environment of Kodiak Island, where the world's largest brown bears had evolved in isolation for thousands of years. Completing the research team was Elena Rodriguez, a 34-year-old environmental consultant and former wilderness guide whose extensive backcountry experience had made her an invaluable asset for expeditions requiring advanced camping and safety protocols in remote locations. Elena's responsibilities included camp security, equipment management, and serving as the team's primary safety officer, a role that required constant vigilance in an environment where brown bears could appear without warning and where the nearest emergency services were hours away by float plane. Her background included wilderness first aid certification, extensive experience with bear deterrent systems, and intimate familiarity with leave no trace principles that would minimize their impact on the sensitive ecosystem they were studying. Their base camp had been established according to strict protocols designed to minimize attracting bears while providing optimal observation opportunities. The team's 4 mountaineering tents were positioned in a tight cluster on elevated ground, surrounded by a perimeter of motion-activated alarms and electric fencing powered by portable solar panels. All food and scented items were stored in bear-proof containers positioned downwind from the camp, and cooking activities were restricted to a designated area 50 yards from their sleeping quarters. Elena had insisted on multiple backup plans for emergency evacuation, including predetermined rally points, emergency communication procedures, and detailed maps marking the locations of emergency supply caches that MAC had positioned at strategic locations during previous flights to the area. The salmon run they had come to observe represented one of nature's most spectacular annual events, as thousands of spawning fish fought their way upstream from Shelikof Strait toward their natal waters in the headwaters of Karluk River. The abundance of salmon during the peak of the run typically attracted dozens of brown bears to the area, creating feeding congregations that offered researchers unprecedented opportunities to observe bear social behavior and feeding strategies. Under normal circumstances, the bears would focus exclusively on the abundant fish, showing little interest in human activities occurring at appropriate distances. However, the recent reports from fishing guides suggested that something had disrupted these normal patterns, leading to more frequent and more aggressive bear encounters than anyone could remember in previous years. Sarah lowered her field glasses and consulted the waterproof notebook where she'd been recording her observations throughout the afternoon. In the 3 days since their arrival, the team had documented the presence of at least 12 individual brown bears, utilizing the salmon fishing areas along their section of the river, ranging from a massive adult male that James estimated at over 9 feet tall when standing upright, to a female with 2 second-year cubs who demonstrated remarkable fishing skills despite the challenges of feeding while protecting her offspring. The behavioral observations had been largely consistent with established research on brown bear feeding patterns, with individual bears maintaining respectful distances from one another, dominant animals securing the most productive fishing spots, and younger or smaller bears adapting their feeding schedules to avoid conflicts with larger individuals. However, Sarah had begun to notice subtle signs that suggested elevated stress levels among the bear population. Several individuals had demonstrated heightened vigilance behaviors, frequently interrupting their feeding to scan their surroundings for potential threats. The large male, whom Rebecca had nicknamed Goliath, due to his impressive size, had exhibited territorial behaviors that seemed more intense than typical for this time of year, including aggressive displays toward other bears that ventured too close to his preferred fishing area. Most concerning was the behavior of the female with cubs, who had abandoned a prime fishing location the previous evening after appearing to detect some stimulus that the research team had been unable to identify. Dr. Mitchell emerged from his tent at 4:30 in the afternoon, carrying his latest batch of audio recordings and wearing an expression that immediately caught Sarah's attention. James had been analyzing the vocalizations recorded by his remote monitoring equipment, comparing the frequency and intensity of bear vocalizations in their study area to baseline data he'd collected in similar environments throughout Alaska. His preliminary analysis suggested that the bears were exhibiting vocal patterns typically associated with heightened stress or territorial disputes, but the triggers for these behaviors remained unclear. "Sarah, I think you need to hear this," James said, connecting his recording equipment to a portable speaker system. "I've been reviewing the audio from last night, and there's something unusual in the vocal patterns from around 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. The bears are demonstrating stress vocalizations that don't correlate with any feeding competition or territorial disputes that we've observed during our daylight monitoring." The recordings revealed a complex soundscape of bear vocalizations that painted an auditory picture of the animals' nighttime activities along the river. James had learned to interpret the subtle differences between various types of bear communication, from the low huffing sounds that indicated mild agitation to the more intense vocalizations that suggested genuine alarm or territorial disputes. The recordings from the previous night included several sequences where multiple bears had engaged in vocal exchanges that suggested they were responding to some common stimulus, but the nature of that stimulus remained mysterious. Rebecca looked up from her camera equipment, where she'd been reviewing the thousands of images she'd captured over the past 3 days. Her photographs provided a visual record that complemented James's audio data, documenting the subtle behavioral changes that might not be apparent to casual observation. "I've been noticing similar stress indicators in the photographs," she said, displaying a series of images on her camera's LCD screen. "Look at the body language in these shots from yesterday afternoon. The ears are positioned differently than what I typically see during normal feeding behavior, and several individuals are showing repetitive behaviors that suggest anxiety." David had spent the morning analyzing water temperature and flow data, investigating whether environmental factors might be influencing bear behavior. His measurements indicated that river conditions were well within normal ranges for this time of year, with water temperatures and flow rates that should have been optimal for salmon migration and bear feeding activities. However, his data collection had revealed some unusual readings from upstream monitoring stations, suggesting possible disturbances in the watershed that might be affecting fish behavior and, consequently, bear feeding patterns. Eleanor had been monitoring weather forecasts and communication with Mac, who was scheduled to return for their pickup in 4 days. The weather predictions indicated the possibility of an early autumn storm system moving in from the Gulf of Alaska, which could potentially strand the team in their current location for several additional days if visibility conditions prevented safe aircraft operations. Elena's contingency planning included sufficient supplies for an extended stay, but the prospect of remaining in the area during a storm while bears were exhibiting unusual behaviors added an element of concern to their mission. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Sarah made the decision to extend their observation period into the early hours of darkness, hoping to identify whatever factors might be causing the stress behaviors that James's recordings had revealed. The team implemented their nighttime observation protocols, which included positioning motion-activated night vision cameras at strategic locations, maintaining communication schedules with their base camp, and establishing watch rotations that would ensure continuous monitoring while allowing team members adequate rest. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon at approximately 6:15, casting long shadows across the river valley and creating the golden hour lighting conditions that Rebecca particularly valued for her photography. The changing light seemed to trigger increased activity among the bears, with several individuals that had remained hidden in the surrounding forest during the heat of the afternoon, emerging to take advantage of the cooler evening temperatures and reduced human activity. Goliath appeared at his usual fishing spot at 6:45, moving with the confident, deliberate pace that marked him as the dominant bear in their observation area. His massive frame, which James estimated at approximately 1,200 pounds, moved with surprising grace as he entered the water and positioned himself at the base of a small waterfall where salmon were forced to navigate a narrow channel. Rebecca began photographing his fishing technique, capturing the precise timing and coordination required for successful salmon capture while maintaining the telephoto distance that ensured her safety. The female with cubs emerged from the forest approximately 15 minutes later, but her behavior immediately struck the observers as unusual. Rather than proceeding directly to her preferred fishing area, she spent several minutes scanning the surrounding area with obvious agitation, frequently standing on her hind legs to improve her vantage point, and emitting low vocalizations that James recognized as distress calls. Her two cubs remained close to her side, demonstrating the heightened alertness that young bears learn from their mothers when sensing potential danger. Sarah focused her field glasses on the female's behavior, noting the tension in her posture and the frequency of her environmental scanning. "Something's definitely bothering her," Sarah observed, speaking quietly to avoid any possibility of attracting the bear's attention. "She's exhibiting classic stress indicators, but I can't identify the stimulus that's causing her reaction." James was recording the female's vocalizations while simultaneously monitoring his remote audio sensors for any sounds that might explain her agitated state. The audio landscape included the normal sounds of flowing water, wind in the surrounding vegetation, and the occasional splash of salmon jumping upstream, but nothing that would typically trigger such obvious distress in an experienced adult female bear. However, James's sensitive recording equipment was detecting low-frequency sounds that were barely audible to human ears, and he began to suspect that the bears might be responding to acoustic stimuli that the research team couldn't perceive without specialized equipment. David was consulting his field notes and environmental data, searching for correlations between the timing of unusual bear behaviors and any measurable environmental changes. His preliminary analysis suggested that the stress behaviors were more frequent during specific time periods, particularly during the late evening and early morning hours, when human activity in the area was minimal. This pattern suggested that whatever was causing the bear's agitation was not related to the presence of the research team, but rather to some other factor that followed a predictable temporal pattern. Elena was conducting a security assessment of their camp and observation positions, ensuring that their bear deterrent systems were functioning properly and that emergency evacuation routes remained clear. Her experience in backcountry environments had taught her to trust her instincts when animals were exhibiting unusual behaviors, and the stress indicators they were observing suggested the possibility of some threat or disturbance that hadn't yet been identified. Elena made the decision to implement enhanced security protocols for the evening, including more frequent communication checks and reduced distances between team members during observation activities. As darkness began to settle over the river valley, the team's night vision equipment revealed a landscape that was dramatically different from the daytime environment they'd been observing. The thermal imaging cameras showed heat signatures of bears moving through the forest at distances that would have been impossible to detect through conventional observation, and the motion-activated trail cameras began capturing images of animals that had remained hidden during daylight hours. The nighttime ecosystem was revealing itself to be far more complex and active than their daytime observations had suggested. At approximately 9:30 p.m., James's audio monitoring equipment detected a series of low-frequency vocalizations from upstream that immediately caught his attention. The sounds were unlike any bear vocalizations in his extensive reference library, consisting of deep, resonant calls that seemed to carry for considerable distances through the valley. The timing and frequency of these calls suggested some form of long-distance communication, possibly between bears that were separated by significant distances, but the purpose and meaning of these vocalizations remained unclear. Rebecca was operating her night vision photography equipment when she first detected unusual movement patterns in the forest beyond their normal observation area. Through her telephoto lenses, she could see shapes moving through the trees with a purposeful, coordinated pattern that didn't match the typical random movements of individual bears foraging independently. The thermal signatures suggested multiple large animals moving in loose formation, potentially heading toward the salmon fishing areas where the team had been conducting their observations. Sarah was reviewing the day's data collection when Elena's voice crackled through her radio headset with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. "Sarah, we need to implement emergency protocols immediately. I'm seeing movement patterns that suggest we may have stumbled into a territorial dispute or feeding competition that's about to escalate beyond anything we're prepared to observe safely." The team quickly implemented their emergency response procedures, which involved consolidating their equipment at predetermined rally points, activating all available bear deterrent systems, and establishing direct communication with MAC for potential emergency evacuation. Elena's assessment of the situation indicated that they might be witnessing the beginning of a significant confrontation between multiple bears, possibly triggered by changes in salmon availability or territorial boundaries that had been disrupted by environmental factors they hadn't yet identified. James's audio monitoring revealed that the unusual vocalizations were increasing in frequency and intensity, suggesting that whatever had been causing stress in the bear population over the past several days was now reaching some form of crescendo. The low-frequency calls were being answered by similar vocalizations from multiple directions, indicating that bears throughout the valley were communicating about some common stimulus or threat. The coordinated nature of these vocal exchanges suggested a level of bear communication and social organization that exceeded anything in James's previous research experience. David's environmental monitoring equipment began detecting unusual readings that correlated with the increasing bear activity. His seismic sensors, originally intended to monitor fish migration patterns through water vibrations, were registering low-frequency tremors that seemed to originate from upstream locations. The timing of these seismic readings coincided with the unusual bear vocalizations, suggesting the possibility that both the bears and the monitoring equipment were detecting the same underlying phenomenon. Rebecca's night vision photography was documenting unprecedented scenes of bear behavior as multiple individuals began converging on their observation area. Her images revealed at least 6 adult bears moving through the forest with obvious purpose, maintaining spacing and coordination that suggested they were responding to some common stimulus rather than engaging in random individual behaviors. The scale and organization of this bear movement was unlike anything she documented in her extensive wildlife photography career. Elena was coordinating the team's defensive preparations when her thermal imaging equipment detected heat signatures that didn't match the expected patterns of bear movement. The signatures were larger and more intense than individual bears, suggesting either multiple animals moving in extremely close proximity or some other heat source that she couldn't immediately identify. Her training and experience in dangerous wildlife situations indicated that they were witnessing the beginning of something that exceeded their safety protocols and observation capabilities. At 10:15 p.m., the source of the unusual activity became dramatically apparent when a massive adult male brown bear emerged from the upstream forest and entered the salmon fishing area with obvious territorial intent. This bear was significantly larger than Goliath, who had been their reference point for dominant male bears in the area, and his behavior immediately indicated that he was asserting territorial claims that would inevitably lead to confrontation with the bears that had been feeding in the area throughout their observation period. James estimated the newcomer's weight at over 1,500 pounds, making him one of the largest brown bears he'd ever observed in the field. The bear's massive head and distinctive shoulder hump indicated exceptional age and experience, while his confident movement patterns suggested familiarity with the area, despite not having appeared during their previous 3 days of observation. James's immediate assessment was that this bear represented the actual dominant animal in the region, and his arrival was triggering the territorial responses they'd been detecting through their audio monitoring. The confrontation between the two massive males began with a series of vocalizations and posturing behaviors that demonstrated the complex social dynamics of brown bear territorial disputes. Goliath, despite his impressive size, immediately recognized the superiority of the newcomer and began implementing submission behaviors designed to avoid physical confrontation. However, the larger male's response suggested that territorial boundaries had been violated in ways that couldn't be resolved through simple dominance displays. Sarah was documenting the behavioral interactions when Elena's urgent voice cut through her concentration. "We need to evacuate immediately. This territorial dispute is happening directly between our observation position and our predetermined evacuation routes. If these bears engage in physical confrontation, we could be trapped in a location that becomes extremely dangerous very quickly." The team began implementing their emergency evacuation procedures, but the rapidly changing situation was creating complications that their planning hadn't anticipated. The convergence of multiple bears on their observation area meant that several of their predetermined evacuation routes were now blocked by animals that could pose serious threats if approached. Elena's assessment indicated that they would need to modify their escape plans in real time, adapting to bear movements and behavioral patterns that were changing by the minute. Rebecca was attempting to document the unprecedented bear behavior while simultaneously preparing her equipment for rapid evacuation. Her professional instincts recognized the scientific value of the behavioral observations they were witnessing, but her survival training emphasized the importance of prioritizing safety over data collection when dealing with potentially dangerous wildlife situations. The conflict between her desire to document the unusual bear interactions and the necessity of implementing emergency protocols created a tension that required immediate resolution. David was securing environmental monitoring equipment while trying to maintain data collection systems that might provide crucial information about whatever factors had triggered the unusual bear activity. His seismic monitors were recording significant ground vibrations that suggested the physical confrontation between the massive males was intensifying, while his audio equipment was documenting vocalizations that indicated additional bears were responding to the territorial dispute from throughout the valley. James was torn between his scientific interest in observing unprecedented bear social dynamics and his responsibility for team safety in an increasingly dangerous situation. The behavioral patterns they were witnessing represented potentially groundbreaking insights into brown bear territorial organization and communication, but the proximity and intensity of the interactions were creating safety risks that exceeded acceptable parameters for wildlife observation. His expertise in bear behavior indicated that the situation could escalate to physical violence with very little warning, potentially creating immediate danger for any humans in the vicinity. The two massive males began circling each other with the deliberate, measured movements that preceded serious physical confrontation. Their vocalizations had intensified to aggressive roars that carried throughout the valley, and their posturing behaviors included all the classic indicators of imminent combat. Sarah's team found themselves in the unprecedented position of being close-range witnesses to what might be the most significant bear territorial dispute ever documented, while simultaneously facing the immediate necessity of removing themselves from a situation that could become life-threatening within minutes. Elena made the critical decision to implement immediate emergency evacuation, recognizing that the scientific value of continued observation was outweighed by the serious risks posed by remaining in proximity to escalating bear aggression. Her command authority over safety protocols meant that her decision was final, regardless of the team's scientific interests, and she began coordinating the emergency procedures that would move them away from the confrontation area as quickly and quietly as possible. The evacuation was complicated by the need to avoid attracting the attention of bears that were already in heightened states of aggression and territorial awareness. Elena's protocols required the team to move slowly and deliberately, avoiding sudden movements or sounds that might trigger defensive or aggressive responses from animals that were already primed for confrontation. The challenge was compounded by the darkness, which limited their ability to monitor bear locations and movements while navigating through terrain that was difficult even under optimal conditions. James was using his expertise in bear behavior to predict movement patterns and identify safe corridors for the team's evacuation when his audio monitoring equipment detected a new set of vocalizations that immediately changed his assessment of the situation. The calls were coming from downstream locations, indicating that additional bears were responding to the territorial dispute and potentially moving toward their location. The complexity and scale of the bear response suggested that they had inadvertently positioned themselves at the center of a territorial reorganization involving potentially a dozen or more individual bears. Rebecca was documenting their evacuation process while maintaining her photographic equipment in ready condition, recognizing that their emergency situation might provide unique opportunities to document bear behavior during extreme circumstances. Her night vision photography was capturing images of the team's movements as they navigated through increasingly challenging terrain while remaining constantly alert for bear activity that could pose immediate threats. David was monitoring environmental conditions and communication systems while assisting with the evacuation, ensuring that their emergency communications with Mac remained functional and that weather conditions continued to support potential emergency aircraft operations. His technical skills were crucial for maintaining the electronic systems that represented their only connection to outside assistance, while his physical conditioning was essential for helping transport essential equipment during their emergency movement. The territorial confrontation between the massive males reached its peak at approximately 11 p.m. when the two bears engaged in direct physical combat with an intensity that shook the ground and created vocalizations that could be heard for miles. Sarah's team, now positioned approximately a quarter-mile from the original confrontation site, could feel the ground vibrations from the physical impact of two animals weighing over a ton, each engaging in combat with prehistoric fury. Elena's emergency evacuation had successfully moved the team away from immediate danger, but their current position offered limited options for further retreat. The terrain features that had initially provided excellent bear observation opportunities were now creating challenges for emergency movement, particularly in darkness and under the stress of potential pursuit by agitated bears. Elena's assessment indicated that they would need to remain in their current position until daylight provided better visibility for safe movement toward their emergency pickup location. The team established a defensive perimeter in their new location, implementing all available bear deterrent systems and maintaining constant vigilance for any indication that the territorial disputes might expand to include their area. Elena's experience had taught her that bear territorial confrontations could trigger aggressive behaviors in other bears throughout the region, creating ripple effects that could persist for days and potentially affect any humans in the vicinity. James was analyzing the acoustic data from the confrontation when he made a discovery that fundamentally changed his understanding of what they were witnessing. The vocalizations and behavioral patterns weren't consistent with typical territorial disputes between individual bears, but rather suggested a more complex social dynamic involving multiple family groups and territorial boundaries that extended far beyond their immediate observation area. The implications suggested that their research site had been positioned at the intersection of territorial claims that involved far more bears than they had initially identified. Rebecca's photography equipment had captured images during their evacuation that revealed the true scale of bear activity in their area. Her night vision images showed heat signatures of bears moving through the forest at distances of up to a mile from their original observation location, indicating that the territorial dispute they had witnessed was triggering responses throughout a much larger area than anyone had anticipated. The coordinated movements and timing of these bear responses suggested a level of social organization that exceeded current scientific understanding of brown bear behavior. Sarah was reassessing their research protocols and safety procedures in light of the evening's events when Elena's voice cut through the darkness with an urgency that immediately focused everyone's attention. We have multiple bears approaching our current position from 3 different directions. Based on their movement patterns, they appear to be investigating our location rather than simply passing through the area. We need to prepare for potential close encounters while maintaining our defensive perimeter. The team implemented their close encounter protocols, which included activating all available noise-making devices, preparing bear spray for immediate use, and establishing communication procedures that would allow coordinated responses to any approaching bears. Elena's training emphasized the importance of presenting a unified, confident presence that would discourage bear approaches while avoiding any actions that might trigger defensive or aggressive responses. David's environmental monitoring revealed that the approaching bears were moving with the deliberate, investigative patterns typical of animals following scent trails or investigating unusual stimuli. His analysis suggested that their evacuation route had left scent markers that were now attracting curious bears, creating the very situation that their emergency protocols had been designed to avoid. The irony that their safety procedures had inadvertently created new safety challenges wasn't lost on the team, but their immediate focus remained on managing the developing situation. James was using his knowledge of bear psychology to predict behavioral responses and develop strategies for discouraging the approaching animals when his audio equipment detected vocalizations that indicated the bears were communicating with each other about their discoveries. The vocal patterns suggested coordination and information sharing that went far beyond simple individual curiosity, indicating that their presence had become a topic of interest among multiple bears in the area. The first bear appeared at the edge of their defensive perimeter at 11:45 p.m., moving with the cautious, investigative behavior typical of an animal encountering novel stimuli. Elena immediately implemented noise-making procedures designed to identify their presence as human while demonstrating confidence and avoiding behaviors that might trigger aggressive responses. The bear's reaction would determine whether they were dealing with simple curiosity or more problematic interest in their activities. Rebecca was prepared to document the encounter while maintaining her position within the defensive perimeter, recognizing that photographic evidence of their close encounter procedures could provide valuable information for improving safety protocols in future research projects. Her professional experience with dangerous wildlife had taught her to balance documentation responsibilities with personal safety requirements, particularly in situations where any sudden movement might trigger unpredictable responses. The approaching bear paused at approximately 50 yards from their position and began the systematic scent investigation typical of bears evaluating novel situations. Elena's assessment indicated that the bear was demonstrating appropriate caution and curiosity rather than aggressive or predatory behaviors, suggesting that their defensive protocols were successfully communicating their human identity and discouraging closer approach. However, the presence of additional bears in the surrounding area meant that the situation remained potentially dangerous despite the individual animals' relatively benign behavior. James was monitoring bear vocalizations when he detected calls from the surrounding forest that indicated their encounter was being observed by additional bears. The acoustic patterns suggested that multiple animals were positioned around their location, potentially creating a situation where their attempts to discourage one bear might trigger responses from others that could complicate their emergency procedures. His expertise indicated that they were experiencing a type of bear encounter that exceeded standard safety protocols and required adaptive responses based on real-time behavioral assessment. David was maintaining communication with Mac and monitoring weather conditions when he received information that immediately changed their emergency status. Mac's radio transmission indicated that weather conditions were deteriorating faster than predicted, with fog and wind conditions that would prevent safe aircraft operations until potentially late the following day. The possibility of extended emergency conditions while dealing with unusual bear activity created a situation that required immediate reassessment of their survival strategies and safety procedures. Elena was coordinating defensive responses when the investigating bear made a decision that caught the team off guard. Rather than departing after satisfying its curiosity, the bear settled into a resting position approximately 30 yards from their perimeter and began the systematic observation behaviors that indicated extended interest in their activities. Elena's experience suggested that this behavior pattern could lead to a prolonged close encounter that would test their emergency supplies and psychological resilience under extremely stressful conditions. Sarah was analyzing the unprecedented nature of their situation when she realized that they had inadvertently created conditions for documenting bear behavior during extended human-bear proximity that had never been systematically studied. The scientific opportunity represented by their emergency situation was potentially groundbreaking, but the personal risks associated with conducting research under such circumstances raised ethical and safety questions that had no clear answers in existing research protocols. The night progressed, with the team maintaining constant vigilance while the investigating bear continued its patient observation from its position just outside their defensive perimeter. James's audio monitoring revealed that additional bears remained in the surrounding area, creating a situation where any movement or change in their defensive posture might trigger responses from multiple animals simultaneously. The complexity of managing a multi-bear encounter during emergency conditions required constant adaptation of their procedures and continuous assessment of changing risk factors. Rebecca was documenting the extended encounter when her night vision equipment revealed behavioral patterns that provided unprecedented insights into bear psychology during novel encounters. Her images showed the observing bear demonstrating problem-solving behaviors and systematic investigation techniques that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond what current research had documented. The scientific value of her photographic documentation was potentially enormous, but the circumstances under which it was being collected created ethical questions about research conducted under emergency conditions. Elena's assessment of their situation indicated that they had sufficient emergency supplies for extended periods. But the psychological stress of maintaining defensive alertness while surrounded by curious bears was beginning to affect team morale and decision-making capabilities. Her experience in dangerous situations emphasized the importance of managing psychological factors that could lead to poor decisions or panic responses that might trigger dangerous reactions from the surrounding wildlife. As the night wore on, the team developed a strange form of equilibrium with their ursine observers. The bears maintained their respectful distances while demonstrating obvious interest in the humans' activities, while the research team maintained their defensive readiness while gradually adapting to the extraordinary circumstances of their prolonged encounter. James's behavioral analysis suggested that they were witnessing a form of interspecies communication and boundary establishment that had rarely been documented under such controlled conditions. David was monitoring environmental conditions when dawn began to illuminate the extraordinary scene that surrounded their defensive position. The morning light revealed that their overnight encounter had involved far more bears than they had realized, with at least 8 individual animals positioned at various distances around their location. The bears' patient, respectful observation of the humans suggested behavioral flexibility and social intelligence that exceeded current scientific understanding of brown bear capabilities. The sunrise brought renewed hope for emergency evacuation as weather conditions began to improve, and Mac's radio communications indicated that aircraft operations might be possible by mid-morning. However, the presence of multiple bears around their location created complications for establishing safe pickup procedures that wouldn't endanger either the research team or the pilot during emergency extraction operations. Elena was coordinating evacuation procedures when the observing bears began demonstrating departure behaviors that suggested their curiosity had been satisfied. The animals' orderly withdrawal from the area occurred with remarkable coordination, indicating that their overnight observation had been a deliberate, organized investigation rather than random individual encounters. The implications for understanding bear social organization and intelligence were profound, but the team's immediate focus remained on safely concluding their emergency situation. Rebecca was capturing the bear's departure when she realized that her photographic documentation of the extended encounter represented potentially the most comprehensive record of human-bear interaction ever collected under natural conditions. Her images showed behavioral nuances and social dynamics that could revolutionize scientific understanding of bear psychology and communication, while simultaneously documenting emergency procedures that could improve safety protocols for future research in bear habitats. James's analysis of the overnight audio recordings revealed patterns of bear communication that indicated sophisticated information sharing and decision-making processes among the animals that had observed their emergency situation. The vocalizations included what appeared to be discussion and consensus-building behaviors that suggested bear social intelligence far beyond current research parameters. The scientific implications were staggering, but the circumstances under which the data had been collected raised questions about research ethics and methodology that would require careful consideration. Mac's voice crackled through their radio communications at 8:30 a.m. with news that weather conditions were improving rapidly and that emergency pickup operations could begin within 2 hours. His assessment of their situation indicated that the departure of most bears from their area would allow safe aircraft operations, provided that the team could establish secure pickup procedures that wouldn't attract renewed bear interest in their activities. Sarah was preparing final documentation of their research results when she realized that their emergency situation had produced scientific data that far exceeded their original research objectives. The behavioral observations, audio recordings, and photographic documentation they had collected during their extended bear encounters provided insights into brown bear social dynamics, intelligence, and human-bear interaction that represented potentially groundbreaking contributions to wildlife research. However, the extreme circumstances under which the data had been collected would require unprecedented analysis of research ethics and methodology. David was securing equipment and preparing for evacuation when his environmental monitoring systems detected the approach of the weather front that had threatened to extend their emergency situation. His analysis indicated that they had a narrow window for safe aircraft operations before conditions deteriorated again, emphasizing the importance of coordinating their evacuation procedures with precision timing and maximum efficiency. Elena was conducting final security assessments when she detected signs that some bears might be returning to investigate the changes in their activities associated with evacuation preparations. Her experience indicated that departure procedures could trigger renewed curiosity from wildlife that had previously maintained respectful distances, potentially creating final safety challenges just as they were preparing to conclude their emergency situation. The sound of Mac's approaching aircraft at 10:15 a.m. provided the team with profound relief after their extraordinary overnight encounter. However, the landing procedures on Karluk Lake required careful coordination to ensure that aircraft noise and human activity didn't trigger aggressive responses from any bears that might still be in the vicinity. Elena's safety protocols required maintaining defensive readiness until the moment they were airborne and safely away from potential bear encounters. Rebecca was conducting final photography of their evacuation site when she captured images that perfectly illustrated the delicate balance between scientific research and personal safety that defined their entire expedition. Her photographs showed the research equipment and defensive positions that had enabled their survival, while the surrounding landscape bore subtle signs of the bear activity that had created their emergency situation. The visual record provided compelling evidence of the challenges and opportunities associated with wildlife research in remote, potentially dangerous environments. James was analyzing final audio data during their evacuation when he identified vocalizations that suggested some bears were responding to their departure activities. The calls indicated continuing interest in their activities, even as they prepared to leave the area, suggesting that their presence had created lasting changes in local bear behavior patterns that might persist long after their departure. The long-term implications for both bear behavior and future research activities in the area would require ongoing monitoring and analysis. Sarah was reviewing their research results as Mac's float plane lifted off from Karluk Lake, carrying the team away from their extraordinary encounter with Kodiak Island's brown bear population. The data they had collected during their 4-day expedition exceeded their original objectives in ways they were still beginning to understand, while their emergency situation had provided insights into human-wildlife interaction that could revolutionize safety protocols and research methodology for future expeditions in bear habitats. The flight back to Anchorage provided the team with opportunities to decompress from their intense wildlife encounter, while beginning the preliminary analysis of data that represented potentially groundbreaking contributions to bear research. Mac's debriefing revealed that unusual bear activity had been reported throughout the Kodiak Island region during the period of their expedition, suggesting that the territorial disputes and social dynamics they had witnessed were part of larger-scale changes in brown bear behavior patterns that warranted ongoing scientific investigation. David's preliminary analysis of environmental data during the return flight revealed correlations between seismic activity and bear behavior patterns that suggested previously unknown factors influencing wildlife behavior in the region. His findings indicated that subtle environmental changes, possibly related to geological activity or ecosystem modifications, might be triggering the unusual bear behaviors that had been reported by fishing guides and documented during their expedition. Elena's assessment of their emergency procedures identified both successes and areas for improvement in wildlife research safety protocols. Their successful management of extended bear encounters under emergency conditions demonstrated the effectiveness of comprehensive safety planning, while revealing gaps in existing protocols that could be addressed through their experience and data collection. Her recommendations would contribute to improved safety standards for future research expeditions in potentially dangerous wildlife habitats. Rebecca's photographic documentation provided visual evidence that would support scientific analysis while creating compelling illustrations of human-wildlife interaction under extraordinary circumstances. Her images captured behavioral nuances and environmental conditions that complemented the audio and observational data collected by other team members, creating a comprehensive record that would support multiple research publications and contribute to improved understanding of brown bear ecology and behavior. James's behavioral analysis during the return flight revealed patterns of bear communication and social organization that challenged existing scientific assumptions about brown bear intelligence and social complexity. His preliminary findings suggested that the bears they had encountered demonstrated cognitive abilities and social coordination that exceeded current research parameters, indicating the need for expanded research methodologies and theoretical frameworks for understanding bear psychology and behavior. Sarah's integration of the various data streams collected during their expedition revealed the emergence of a comprehensive picture of brown bear social dynamics that represented significant advances in wildlife research. The combination of audio recordings, behavioral observations, environmental monitoring, and photographic documentation provided multiple perspectives on bear behavior that would support rigorous scientific analysis while contributing to improved wildlife management and human-bear conflict resolution strategies. The team's return to Anchorage marked the beginning of an extensive analysis process that would transform their field data into scientific publications, safety recommendations, and policy guidelines that could influence wildlife research and management practices throughout Alaska and beyond. Their extraordinary encounter with Kodiak Island's brown bear population had provided insights that would contribute to both scientific understanding and practical applications for managing human-wildlife interactions in rapidly changing environments. Mac's pilot report to aviation authorities included detailed accounts of the weather conditions and wildlife activity that had complicated their expedition, contributing to ongoing efforts to improve safety protocols for aircraft operations in remote wildlife habitats. His observations of unusual bear behavior throughout the region supported the team's findings, while providing additional evidence that their encounter was part of larger-scale changes in wildlife behavior patterns that warranted continued monitoring and research. The preliminary analysis conducted during their return flight indicated that their research had documented previously unknown aspects of brown bear social intelligence, territorial organization, and human-wildlife interaction that would require years of detailed study to fully understand and integrate into existing scientific knowledge. The implications for wildlife management, conservation policy, and human safety in bear habitats were profound and far-reaching. Elena's debriefing process included detailed documentation of their emergency procedures and decision-making processes that would contribute to improved safety training for wildlife researchers working in potentially dangerous environments. Her analysis identified critical factors that had contributed to their successful management of multiple bear encounters, while revealing areas where existing safety protocols could be enhanced through their practical experience and lessons learned. Rebecca's initial review of her photographic documentation revealed thousands of images that captured behavioral details and environmental conditions with unprecedented clarity and scientific value. Her photographs provided visual evidence that would support behavioral analysis while creating compelling documentation of human-wildlife interaction under extraordinary circumstances that could contribute to public education and conservation awareness efforts. James's audio analysis during the return flight revealed complex patterns of bear vocalizations that suggested sophisticated communication systems and social coordination mechanisms that had never been systematically documented in brown bear populations. His preliminary findings indicated the need for expanded research into bear communication and social intelligence that could revolutionize scientific understanding of these remarkable animals. David's environmental data analysis revealed correlations between subtle ecosystem changes and wildlife behavior modifications that suggested previously unknown factors influencing bear ecology in the region. His findings provided evidence that environmental monitoring could serve as an early warning system for predicting changes in wildlife behavior patterns that might affect human-wildlife interaction and safety considerations. Sarah's integration of the multidisciplinary data collected during their expedition revealed the emergence of comprehensive insights into brown bear behavior that represented significant contributions to wildlife research and conservation science. The combination of behavioral observations, audio recordings, environmental monitoring, and photographic documentation provided unprecedented documentation of bear social dynamics and human-wildlife interaction under natural conditions. The team's extraordinary encounter with Kodiak Island's brown bear population had transformed a routine research expedition into a groundbreaking scientific opportunity that would influence wildlife research and management practices for years to come. Their successful navigation of dangerous wildlife encounters while collecting valuable scientific data demonstrated the importance of comprehensive safety planning and adaptive research methodologies in dynamic natural environments. Mac's aircraft touched down at Lake Hood in Anchorage at 2:30 in the afternoon, concluding an expedition that had exceeded all expectations while providing the research team with experiences and data that would influence their careers and scientific understanding for years to come. Their 4-day encounter with brown bear social dynamics had produced insights that would contribute to multiple research publications, improved safety protocols, and enhanced conservation strategies for one of North America's most magnificent predators. The analysis and publication process that followed their return would transform their field observations into scientific contributions that advanced understanding of brown bear behavior while improving safety protocols for researchers working in dangerous wildlife habitats. Their experience demonstrated the delicate balance between scientific opportunity and personal safety that defines wildlife research in remote, potentially dangerous environments, where extraordinary discoveries await those prepared to accept the risks and challenges of studying nature's most powerful predators under natural conditions. Their encounter with the brown bears of Kodiak Island had provided profound insights into the intelligence, social complexity, and behavioral adaptability of these remarkable animals, while demonstrating the importance of respecting wildlife and maintaining appropriate safety protocols when conducting research in their natural habitats. The data they collected would contribute to improved understanding and conservation of brown bear populations, while enhancing safety protocols for future researchers willing to venture into the wilderness areas where these magnificent predators reign supreme. The next stories. February 9th, 2024. Polar bear devours teen siblings in Arctic schoolyard. The February wind carried with it the scent of death long before anyone in Kotzebue, Alaska, understood what had descended upon their small Arctic community. At 3:47 p.m. on that Friday afternoon, the temperature registered negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind gusts reaching 35 miles per hour across the Chukchi Sea ice that stretched endlessly beyond the town's northern border. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered landscape, its pale light offering little warmth to the 3,200 residents of this remote village, situated 549 miles northwest of Anchorage. Jason Michael McCarthy, 15 years old, with sandy brown hair that perpetually fell across his pale green eyes, shouldered his worn black JanSport backpack as the final bell rang at Kotzebue Middle High School. The zipper had been broken for 3 months, held together with silver duct tape that his father, Robert McCarthy, had applied with the patient precision of a man who understood that in the Arctic, everything must be made to last. Jason's fingers, already stiff with cold despite his insulated gloves, fumbled with the straps as he pushed through the double doors of the school's main entrance, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated immediately in the harsh wind. His sister Lily Rose McCarthy, 13 years old with the same green eyes but darker hair that she wore in 2 braids beneath her pink knit hat, waited for him by the flagpole as she did every day. Her purple winter coat, a hand-me-down from their cousin in Fairbanks, was zipped to her chin, and her small hands were buried deep in her pockets where she kept a collection of smooth stones she had gathered from the beach the previous summer. Lily had always been smaller than her classmates, a fact that their mother, Sarah McCarthy, attributed to her premature birth during a particularly brutal November blizzard 14 years earlier, when the town's only doctor had been stranded in Anchorage due to weather. "Hurry up, Jason," Lily called out, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Mum said she's making caribou stew tonight if Dad's hunt went well." She bounced on her feet, partly from excitement and partly to keep warm, her snow boots making small, squeaking sounds against the packed snow beneath her feet. Jason nodded and quickened his pace, his own boots leaving deep impressions in the snow as he approached his sister. Around them, other students from the combined middle and high school were dispersing in various directions throughout the small town. Tommy Kanguk, a 16-year-old Inupiat boy whose family had lived in the region for countless generations, waved goodbye as he headed toward his grandmother's house 3 blocks east. Maria Santos, whose father worked for the Northwest Arctic Borough, climbed into her family's red pickup truck with her younger brother Carlos, age 11, both of them chattering excitedly about the upcoming basketball game against Nome. The McCarthy family had moved to Kotzebue from Soldotna 3 years earlier, when Robert, a wildlife biologist specializing in Arctic marine mammals, had accepted a position with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The transition had been difficult for all of them, but particularly challenging for Jason, who had left behind his best friend Marcus and the basketball team, where he had just earned a starting position as point guard. Sarah, a registered nurse originally from Minnesota, had found work at the Manilac Health Center, the regional medical facility that served not only Kotzebue but also the surrounding villages scattered across the vast expanse of the Northwest Arctic Borough. The McCarthy children had adapted to their new life with the resilience typical of young people, though they still spoke often of their friends in Soldotna and the relatively temperate climate they had left behind. Jason had joined the school's cross-country skiing team and discovered an unexpected talent for the sport, while Lily had thrown herself into her studies and developed a particular fascination with marine biology, inspired by her father's work studying the movements and behavior of polar bears, seals, and walrus populations in the Chukchi Sea. As the siblings began their 15-minute walk home along 3rd Avenue, neither of them noticed the massive white form that had been observing the school from a position approximately 200 yards to the northwest, partially concealed behind a cluster of abandoned oil drums left over from a construction project that had been completed the previous autumn. The polar bear, an adult male weighing approximately 1,100 pounds and measuring nearly 10 feet in length from nose to tail, had been tracking the scents and sounds emanating from the school for the better part of 2 hours. Dr. Margaret Winters, a polar bear specialist with the U.S. Geological Survey, who would later be called in to investigate the incident, would determine that the bear had likely been driven toward the community by a combination of factors that had created what she termed a perfect storm of predatory behavior. The winter of 2023 to 2024 had been particularly harsh, with sea ice forming later than usual and breaking up in unpredictable patterns that had disrupted traditional hunting grounds. The bear, later identified through DNA analysis as a 22-year-old male that had been tagged during a research expedition in 2019, had likely gone without a substantial meal for nearly 3 weeks. The animal's desperation was evident in its physical condition. When examined after the attack, the bear was found to be approximately 200 pounds underweight, with visible signs of malnutrition including a dull coat, prominent rib outline, and behavioral indicators consistent with extreme hunger stress. Dr. Winters would note in her official report that such conditions often led to increasingly bold and aggressive behavior as the animals began to associate human settlements with potential food sources. At 3:52 p.m., Jason and Lily reached the intersection of 3rd Avenue and Bering Street, where they paused momentarily to allow a snowmobile driven by Henry Okafor, the town's postal worker, to pass. Henry, a 53-year-old man who had moved to Kotzebue from Nigeria 15 years earlier to work in the school system before transitioning to postal service, waved at the children as he navigated around a particularly large snowdrift that had accumulated against the side of the Kotzebue Electric Association building. "See you Monday, Mr. Okafor," Lily called out, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Henry smiled and waved back, noting later to investigators that both children had appeared happy and normal, with no indication of the tragedy that would unfold just minutes later. The bear had begun moving at 3:50 p.m., using the scattered buildings and equipment around the town's periphery as cover while maintaining a direct course toward the school playground. Its massive paws, each nearly 12 inches in diameter, left distinct impressions in the snow that would later be measured and photographed by Alaska state troopers and wildlife officials. The animal moved with the calculated patience of an apex predator, pausing frequently to assess its surroundings and test the air for any changes in wind direction that might carry its scent toward potential prey or threats. Kotzebue Middle High School sat on a small rise overlooking Kotzebue Sound, its modern brick construction contrasting sharply with many of the older buildings scattered throughout the community. The playground, located on the school's eastern side, was enclosed by a chain-link fence that stood 6 feet high and was topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. The fencing had been installed in 2018 following a series of incidents involving unleashed dogs, but it had never been designed or intended to deter large wildlife. At 3:54 p.m., Jason and Lily turned east onto 4th Avenue, their destination the small blue house with white trim that their family rented from Eleanor Nasuk, a 67-year-old Inupiat woman whose late husband had worked for decades as a hunting guide. The house, built in 1987, sat on a quarter-acre lot approximately 0.8 miles from the school, a distance that the children covered daily, regardless of weather conditions. Sarah McCarthy had initially worried about the walk, particularly during the darkest months of winter, but both children had demonstrated remarkable adaptation to the Arctic environment and had never experienced any significant problems during their daily commute. The bear reached the school's eastern fence at 3:55 p.m., its keen sense of smell detecting the lingering odors of dozens of children who had played on the equipment throughout the day. The animal's black nose, approximately 4 inches wide and perfectly adapted for detecting scents across vast distances, twitched as it processed the complex mixture of human activity, food remnants, and the distinctive scents that children leave behind. Polar bears possess an olfactory system that is 7 times more sensitive than that of a bloodhound, capable of detecting seal-breathing holes beneath 3 feet of snow from distances exceeding 20 miles. What happened next would be reconstructed through a combination of physical evidence, witness statements, and the expertise of multiple specialists in polar bear behavior. The bear, driven by hunger and the increasingly bold behavior patterns that Dr. Winters had documented in other cases, began to test the integrity of the fence. Its massive front paws, equipped with curved claws up to 4 inches in length, found purchase on the chain-link material approximately 18 inches from the ground. Inside the school building, custodian James Tokiena was completing his daily maintenance routine when he happened to glance out a window facing the playground. James, a 42-year-old man who had worked at the school for 7 years, initially thought he was seeing a large white dog, or perhaps one of the semi-feral Arctic foxes that occasionally wandered through the community. It took several seconds for his brain to process the true size and nature of what he was observing. "Jesus Christ," James whispered, his words fogging the window as he pressed his face closer to the glass. His hands trembled as he reached for his cell phone, a basic model that often struggled with reception in the remote location, but represented his only immediate means of communication with the outside world. The phone's display showed 3:56 p.m. as James dialed 911, his fingers slipping on the small buttons due to a combination of cold and the adrenaline that was beginning to flood his system. The emergency dispatcher, Patricia Kowalski, a 38-year-old woman who had moved to Kotzebue from Chicago 5 years earlier when her husband accepted a teaching position at the school, answered on the second ring. Patricia had handled numerous emergency calls during her tenure, ranging from medical emergencies and domestic disturbances to the occasional wildlife encounter, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was about to hear. 911, what is your emergency? Patricia's professional tone carried clearly through the connection. "There's a polar bear at the school," James said, his voice rising with each word. "It's trying to get through the fence around the playground. There might still be kids out there." Patricia's training kicked in immediately, her fingers moving across her keyboard as she began entering the incident details into the emergency response system. The timestamp on her computer screen read 3:56:47 p.m. as she initiated protocols that would bring multiple agencies into coordination within minutes. "Are you in a safe location, James?" Patricia asked, recognizing his voice from previous non-emergency calls. "Can you see the bear right now?" "Yeah, I can see it. It's a big one, Patricia. Really big. And it's pushing on the fence. The fence isn't going to hold." At that precise moment, approximately 200 yards southeast of the school, Jason and Lily McCarthy were engaged in one of their typical sibling conversations, their voices barely audible above the constant Arctic wind. Jason was describing a science project he was planning on the Aurora Borealis, while Lily shared her excitement about a book she was reading on Arctic wildlife. Neither child was aware that their father's professional expertise was about to become tragically relevant to their own lives. Dad says the polar bears are having a hard time this year, Lily said, adjusting her backpack straps as they walked. The ice isn't forming right, so they can't hunt seals like they're supposed to. Jason nodded, his breath creating small puffs of vapor that were immediately swept away by the wind. Yeah, he's been tracking some of them with GPS collars. He says they're having to travel much farther to find food. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound that neither child could immediately identify. It was a metallic groaning, followed by what sounded like something large moving through snow. Both children stopped walking and turned toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from the direction of their school. At 3:57 p.m., the polar bear successfully breached the school's perimeter fence. The animal's weight and determination had proven too much for the chain-link barrier, which separated at one of its connecting points with a sharp metallic snap that echoed across the playground equipment. The bear squeezed through the opening, its massive frame moving with surprising agility despite its size and physical condition. James Tokiena watched in horror as the bear entered the playground, his phone still pressed to his ear as he provided Patricia with a running commentary of what he was witnessing. "It's inside the fence now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow attract the animal's attention. "Oh God, it's heading toward the street, toward where the kids walk home." Patricia immediately began dispatching emergency responders, her fingers flying across multiple computer systems as she coordinated the response. At 3:57:23 p.m., she contacted Alaska State Troopers Post C in Kotzebue, where Trooper Michael Harrison, a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in wildlife encounters, was reviewing paperwork from an earlier domestic disturbance call. At 3:57:41 p.m., she reached the Kotzebue Police Department, where Officer Susan Greenberg was preparing to begin her evening patrol. At 3:57:56 p.m., she contacted Robert McCarthy directly at his office at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, knowing that his expertise with polar bear behavior might be crucial in managing the situation. Robert McCarthy answered his phone on the first ring, his voice carrying the professional calm that had served him well during 15 years of wildlife management work. "Fish and Game. This is Robert." "Robert, this is Patricia at dispatch. We have a polar bear situation at the school. It's breached the playground fence and appears to be moving toward the residential area." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. His children walked past that playground every day. His children should be walking past that area right now. His hands began to shake as he glanced at the clock on his office wall, which read 3:58 p.m. "Where exactly is the bear now?" Robert asked, already reaching for his coat and the specialized equipment he kept for emergency wildlife encounters. His office, located in a small building adjacent to the airport, was approximately 1.2 miles from the school and normally required a 4-minute drive under good conditions. "Last visual had it moving southeast from the playground," Patricia replied. "James Tokiena is maintaining observation from inside the school building." Robert's knowledge of polar bear behavior patterns flooded through his mind as he processed this information. A hungry bear moving toward residential areas represented an extreme danger, particularly during afternoon hours when children would be walking home from school. His own children would be somewhere along 4th Avenue, their usual route home. "I'm en route," Robert said, ending the call and immediately dialing his wife's cell phone number. Sarah McCarthy was scheduled to end her shift at the health center at 4 p.m., which meant she would likely still be completing patient documentation or preparing for the next day's appointments. At 3:58:47 p.m., Jason and Lily McCarthy heard the sound again, this time much closer and more distinct. It was definitely something large moving through the snow, accompanied by a low huffing sound that neither child recognized. They had stopped walking and were standing approximately 50 yards from the intersection of 4th Avenue and Lagoon Street, their small forms clearly visible against the white landscape. "What do you think that is?" Lily asked, her voice carrying a note of concern that hadn't been present earlier. She moved slightly closer to her older brother, an unconscious defensive behavior that children often display when sensing potential danger. Jason strained to see through the blowing snow and the maze of buildings, equipment and vehicles that characterized their neighborhood. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows and making it difficult to distinguish between natural formations and potential threats. "I don't know," he said, "but maybe we should head home a little faster." The bear emerged from behind a cluster of abandoned shipping containers at 3:59 p.m., its massive white form moving with the rolling gait characteristic of its species. At this distance, approximately 30 yards from the children, its size became immediately apparent. Adult male polar bears represent the largest land carnivores in North America, and this particular animal, despite its malnourished condition, still presented an imposing and terrifying figure. Lily saw it first. Her young eyes more quickly adapted to movement in the Arctic landscape. The scream that escaped her lips was high-pitched and filled with the primal terror that humans experience when confronted by an apex predator. The sound carried clearly across the snow-covered terrain, reaching James Tokiena at his observation post inside the school building and causing him to press his face harder against the window as he tried to locate the source. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," James whispered into his phone, his words coming out in a rapid stream as he spotted the two small figures standing in the bear's direct path. "There are kids out there. 2 kids. The bear is moving toward them." Jason's reaction was immediate but tragically inadequate for the situation they faced. His 15-year-old mind, despite his father's extensive knowledge of wildlife behavior, could not instantly process the correct response to a polar bear encounter. Instead of the counterintuitive actions that might have improved their chances of survival, standing tall, making noise, backing away slowly while maintaining eye contact, Jason grabbed his sister's hand and began to run. The movement triggered an immediate response from the bear, whose predatory instincts had been honed by millions of years of evolution. The animal's head snapped toward the fleeing children, its black nose testing the air as it detected the scent of fear-induced adrenaline and the movement patterns that signified prey behavior. Within seconds, the bear had transitioned from a methodical investigation of potential food sources to active pursuit of identified targets. Dr. Margaret Winters would later explain in her official report that running from a polar bear represents one of the most dangerous responses possible during such an encounter. Unlike grizzly bears, which may engage in bluff charges or defensive behavior, polar bears are pure predators with no natural fear of humans. When presented with fleeing prey, their instinctual response is to pursue, capture, and kill. At 4 p.m., Robert McCarthy was racing through the streets of Kotzebue in his department-issued pickup truck, his emergency lights activated and his radio crackling with updates from Patricia Kowalski and the responding law enforcement officers. His knowledge of the town's layout told him that his children would most likely be somewhere along 4th Avenue. But the bear's exact location remained unclear as different witnesses provided conflicting information about its movement patterns. Trooper Michael Harrison reached the scene at 4:34 p.m., his patrol vehicle sliding slightly on the icy pavement as he navigated the turn onto 4th Avenue. Harrison, a 41-year-old man originally from Montana, had encountered polar bears twice during his 15 years of service in Alaska, but both previous incidents had involved animals that had been successfully scared away or tranquilized before any harm occurred. What Harrison saw as he rounded the corner defied his worst expectations and challenged every aspect of his training in crisis response. Approximately 60 yards ahead of his vehicle, a massive polar bear was in active pursuit of 2 small figures who were running desperately through the snow. Even at this distance, Harrison could see that the bear was closing the gap between itself and the children with terrifying efficiency. "Dispatch, this is Trooper Harrison," he said into his radio, while simultaneously accelerating his vehicle toward the scene. "I have visual on the bear and 2 juvenile subjects. The bear is in active pursuit. I need immediate backup and medical response." The polar bear's running speed, even in its weakened condition, was significantly greater than that of the 2 children struggling through the snow in their winter clothing. Adult polar bears can reach speeds of up to 25 miles per hour over short distances, their massive paws acting as natural snowshoes that provide excellent traction on various Arctic surfaces. Jason and Lily, burdened by heavy winter clothing and limited by their smaller stride length, were managing perhaps 8 to 10 miles per hour across the uneven terrain. At 4:02 p.m., Jason made a decision that would haunt investigators and family members for years to come. Realizing that they could not outrun the bear, and perhaps remembering something his father had mentioned about creating barriers between humans and dangerous wildlife, he pushed Lily toward a cluster of playground equipment that was visible approximately 20 yards to their left. The equipment, part of a small neighborhood park that served the residential area, included a swing set, a slide, and several smaller pieces designed for younger children. "Get behind the swings!" Jason shouted to his sister, his voice breaking with exhaustion and terror. "Maybe it won't be able to reach us there." Lily stumbled through the snow toward the playground equipment, her small legs pumping desperately as she tried to reach what appeared to be a potential safe haven. Her purple coat, bright against the white landscape, made her easily visible to both the pursuing bear and the emergency responders who were converging on the scene. The bear reached the playground area at 4:01 p.m., its massive form covering the final yards with explosive speed that demonstrated the deceptive agility possessed by these Arctic predators. The animal's hunting instincts, sharpened by weeks of unsuccessful foraging, had locked onto the 2 children as the best opportunity for a meal that it had encountered in recent memory. Trooper Harrison abandoned his patrol vehicle at 4:01:15 p.m., leaving the engine running and the emergency lights flashing as he drew his service weapon and began running toward the playground. His Glock 22.40 caliber pistol, standard issue for Alaska State Troopers, represented one of the few weapons immediately available that might be capable of stopping a charging polar bear, though Harrison knew that even perfect shot placement would require multiple hits to bring down an animal of such size and determination. The first attack occurred at 4:01:33 p.m. Lily had reached the swing set and was attempting to climb onto one of the seats when the bear's massive paw struck her across the back with tremendous force. The impact lifted the 13-year-old girl completely off the ground and sent her tumbling approximately 8 feet through the air before she landed face first in a deep snowdrift near the base of the slide. The sound of the impact, a sickening combination of the bear's claws striking winter clothing and the child's involuntary cry of pain, carried clearly across the playground and would later be described by witnesses as unlike anything they had ever heard. James Tokiena, still maintaining his observation post at the school, reported that the sound caused him to vomit into the wastebasket beside his desk. Jason's reaction to seeing his sister attacked demonstrated the fierce protective instincts that often emerge during life-threatening situations. Despite his terror and the obvious futility of the action, the 15-year-old boy began shouting at the bear and throwing handfuls of snow in an attempt to distract the animal from his injured sister. "Hey! Hey! Over here!" Jason screamed, his voice cracking with emotion as he tried to draw the bear's attention away from Lily. "Leave her alone!" The polar bear's response was swift and decisive. At 4:01:47 p.m., the animal pivoted toward Jason with fluid grace, its powerful hindquarters propelling it across the intervening distance in less than 2 seconds. The bear's attack on Jason was more direct and devastating than its initial strike on Lily. as the animal's jaws closed around the teenager's torso with the crushing force that had evolved to break through thick seal hide and blubber. Trooper Harrison reached effective firing range at 4:01:52 p.m. and immediately began engaging the bear with his service weapon. His first shot, aimed at the animal's center mass, struck the bear in the left shoulder, but failed to immediately incapacitate the massive predator. The bear's thick hide, dense muscle mass, and the adrenaline coursing through its system allowed it to continue its attack despite the gunshot wound. The second shot, fired 2.3 seconds after the first, struck the bear in the neck area but again failed to bring down the animal. Harrison continued firing while simultaneously attempting to close the distance between himself and the scene, his training and experience guiding his actions, even as the horror of the situation threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. At 4:02:05 p.m., Robert McCarthy arrived at the scene in his Fish and Game vehicle, his worst fears confirmed as he witnessed the polar bear attacking his children. The sight of his son in the bear's jaws and his daughter lying motionless near the slide created a psychological trauma that would affect him for the remainder of his life. Robert's training in wildlife management included protocols for tranquilizing dangerous animals, but the tranquilizer gun and chemical immobilization equipment in his vehicle required several minutes to prepare and would not take effect for 10 to 15 minutes after injection. Instead, Robert grabbed the .45-70 rifle that he kept for emergency wildlife encounters, a lever-action weapon loaded with 500-grain bullets specifically designed for stopping large and dangerous animals. His hands, steadied by years of hunting experience and the desperate need to save his children, brought the rifle to his shoulder as he sought a clear shot at the bear without risking additional harm to Jason. The bear's attack on Jason lasted approximately 90 seconds, during which the animal's powerful jaws and claws inflicted massive trauma to the teenager's chest, abdomen, and arms. The polar bear's bite force, measured at approximately 1,200 pounds per square inch, easily penetrated Jason's winter clothing and caused severe damage to internal organs. Throughout the attack, Jason remained conscious and continued to struggle, his survival instincts driving him to fight back despite the hopelessness of his situation. At 4:02:47 p.m., Robert McCarthy fired his first shot at the polar bear, the heavy bullet striking the animal in the side and causing it to release its grip on Jason. The bear stumbled backward, blood visible on its white fur, but remained standing and alert. The animal's attention shifted between the injured boy at its feet and the multiple threats represented by the armed humans who had surrounded the playground area. Officer Susan Greenberg arrived at 4:03:12 p.m., adding her service weapon to the coordinated response as she positioned herself to provide additional covering fire. Greenberg, a 35-year-old woman with 12 years of law enforcement experience, had never encountered a situation quite like this, but recognized the need for immediate and overwhelming force to stop the bear's attack. The bear's second assault began at 4:03:25 p.m., when the wounded animal, despite its injuries, launched itself toward Lily's position near the slide. The 13-year-old girl had regained consciousness following the initial attack and was attempting to crawl away from the playground equipment when the bear reached her location. What followed was the most devastating portion of the attack, as the bear's predatory behavior shifted from the quick-killing techniques used on Jason to the more methodical feeding behavior that polar bears typically employ when consuming their prey. The animal's massive jaws closed around Lily's midsection, while its front paws held her in position, the combination creating traumatic injuries that would prove immediately fatal. Robert McCarthy's second shot struck the bear in the head at 4:03:41 p.m., the heavy bullet penetrating the animal's skull and causing immediate incapacitation. The polar bear collapsed beside Lily's motionless form, its massive body twitching briefly before becoming still. The entire attack sequence, from first contact to final shot, had lasted just over 2 minutes, but the devastation accomplished in that brief time period would affect the Kotzebue community for years to come. Trooper Harrison reached Jason's position at 4:03:55 p.m. and immediately began applying first aid techniques learned during his emergency medical training. The teenager was conscious but in severe shock, his breathing rapid and shallow as his body attempted to cope with massive blood loss and traumatic injuries. Harrison used his portable radio to request immediate medical evacuation while applying pressure to the most severe wounds. Dispatch, this is Harrison. I need life flight immediately. We have 2 juvenile subjects with severe trauma from polar bear attack. One subject is conscious and breathing, the other appears to be... Harrison's voice trailed off as he looked toward Lily's position near the slide, where Officer Greenberg was checking for vital signs. Robert McCarthy reached his daughter at 4:04:18 p.m., his worst fears confirmed as he knelt beside her small form in the blood-stained snow. Lily's injuries were incompatible with life, the bear's attack having caused traumatic damage to vital organs that no amount of medical intervention could repair. Robert's training in wildlife biology had made him familiar with the feeding behavior of large predators, but nothing in his professional experience had prepared him for seeing such behavior applied to his own child. The sound that emerged from Robert McCarthy at that moment, part scream, part sob, part primal expression of grief, would later be described by responding personnel as the most heartbreaking sound they had ever heard. Officer Greenberg, despite her years of law enforcement experience, found herself struggling to maintain professional composure as she witnessed a father's recognition of his daughter's death. At 4:04:47 p.m., Sarah McCarthy arrived at the scene after being contacted by Patricia Kowalski and rushing from her position at the health center. Sarah's medical training allowed her to quickly assess both children's conditions, but her role as a mother made it nearly impossible for her to function professionally in this situation. She immediately focused her attention on Jason, whose injuries, while severe, offered some possibility of survival with immediate and aggressive medical intervention. "We need to get him to the clinic now," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He's losing too much blood to wait for life flight." The decision to transport Jason by ground to the Manilac Health Center rather than waiting for air evacuation was made based on several factors, including weather conditions, the severity of his injuries, and the immediate availability of medical facilities in Kotzebue. The health center, while not equipped for major trauma surgery, possessed the basic capabilities needed to stabilize Jason's condition until he could be transferred to more advanced facilities in Anchorage. At 4:06:22 p.m., Jason McCarthy was loaded into an ambulance operated by the Kotzebue Volunteer Fire Department, with his mother Sarah accompanying him and providing continuous medical monitoring during the brief transport to the health center. The teenager remained conscious throughout the transport, occasionally asking about his sister and receiving non-committal responses from the medical personnel who were focused on keeping him alive. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the emergency physician on duty at the Manilac Health Center, had been alerted to the incoming trauma case and had prepared the facility's small emergency department for a critical patient. Dr. Chen, a 39-year-old physician originally from Seattle, who had been working in rural Alaska for 6 years, had treated numerous wildlife-related injuries during her tenure, but had never encountered the level of trauma associated with a polar bear attack. Jason's arrival at the health center at 4:09:15 p.m. triggered a coordinated medical response that would continue for the next several hours. His injuries included multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, severe lacerations to both arms, and significant blood loss that required immediate transfusion. Dr. Chen's initial assessment revealed that while Jason's injuries were life-threatening, They were potentially survivable if he could be stabilized and transported to a Level 1 trauma center. The process of stabilizing Jason for medical evacuation required nearly 2 hours of intensive medical intervention. Dr. Chen, assisted by registered nurses Amanda Kowalski, Patricia's sister-in-law, and David Simmons, worked to control bleeding, establish intravenous access, and provide respiratory support while coordinating with trauma specialists in Anchorage, who would receive the patient. Meanwhile, at the attack scene, Alaska State Troopers and local law enforcement had established a perimeter around the playground area, while wildlife officials began the process of examining the deceased polar bear and collecting physical evidence. The bear's body, weighing approximately 1,100 pounds, required specialized equipment for removal and transport to facilities where necropsy examination could be performed. Dr. Margaret Winters arrived in Kotzebue at 6:47 p.m. aboard a charter flight from Fairbanks, her expertise in polar bear behavior making her involvement essential for the official investigation. Dr. Winters, a 52-year-old wildlife biologist with over 20 years of experience studying Arctic predators, had investigated numerous human-bear encounters but had never dealt with a case involving such young victims in a residential setting. Her initial examination of the scene revealed several factors that had contributed to the attack's severity. The bear's physical condition, the breakdown of normal behavioral barriers between the animals and human settlements, and the unfortunate timing that placed the children in the bear's path, had combined to create what she would later term a catastrophic convergence of environmental and behavioral factors. The necropsy examination of the polar bear, conducted the following day at facilities in Anchorage, revealed the extent of the animal's desperation. The bear's stomach contained only small amounts of vegetation and debris, confirming that it had not successfully hunted in an extended period. The animal's fat reserves, crucial for polar bear survival during periods when hunting is difficult, had been almost completely depleted. Dr. Winters' examination also revealed that the bear had been previously tagged during a research expedition in 2019, allowing researchers to trace its movements and behavior patterns over the 5 years preceding the attack. GPS collar data, recovered from archived research files, showed that the animal had traveled over 400 miles from its normal range, suggesting the severe environmental pressures that had driven it toward human settlements. Jason McCarthy was transferred to Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage aboard a Life Flight helicopter at 8:23 p.m. on February 9th, accompanied by Dr. Chen and a critical care nurse. The 549-mile flight, normally requiring approximately 90 minutes, was complicated by severe weather conditions that forced the medical crew to make a refueling stop in Nome. The teenage survivor of the attack underwent his first surgical procedure at 11:47 p.m., with trauma surgeon Dr. Michael Rodriguez leading a team of specialists in addressing the most life-threatening injuries. The surgery, lasting 4 hours and 37 minutes, focused on repairing damage to internal organs and controlling internal bleeding that continued to threaten Jason's survival. Dr. Rodriguez, a 44-year-old surgeon originally from Texas who had specialized in trauma surgery for 15 years, later described Jason's injuries as among the most severe wildlife-related trauma he had encountered during his career. The bear's claws and teeth had caused damage to the liver, spleen, and several sections of intestine, while also creating significant soft tissue injuries that would require multiple additional surgeries to repair. The news of the polar bear attack spread rapidly through Kotzebue's small community, with residents gathering at the community center and local churches to support the McCarthy family and process the collective trauma of losing 2 young community members to such a violent event. The attack represented the first fatal polar bear encounter in Kotzebue's recorded history, though similar incidents had occurred in other Arctic communities over the years. Mayor Charlotte Kowalski called an emergency town meeting for 7 p.m. on February 10th, the day following the attack, to address community concerns and discuss potential measures for preventing similar incidents in the future. The meeting, held at the Kotzebue Community Center, drew nearly 800 residents, representing approximately 1/4 of the town's total population. Community members expressed a wide range of emotions and concerns during the meeting. Fear for their own children's safety was paramount, but residents also grappled with the complex relationship between their community and the Arctic wildlife that had sustained their ancestors for countless generations. Many residents recognized that polar bears were facing unprecedented challenges due to climate change and environmental pressures, even while mourning the loss of the two children. Elder Tommy Kowalski, Charlotte's father-in-law and a respected member of the local Inupiat community, spoke about the traditional relationship between his people and polar bears, describing the animals as both feared and revered elements of Arctic life. His words provided cultural context for the tragedy, while also emphasizing the need for practical measures to protect community members from similar incidents. "Our ancestors knew these bears," Tommy said, his 78-year-old voice carrying clearly through the packed community center. "They understood that we must respect their power and their needs, but we also must protect our families. This bear was sick, desperate. It had forgotten the old boundaries." The investigation into the circumstances surrounding the attack involved multiple agencies and specialists, each examining different aspects of the incident to develop comprehensive understanding of what had occurred and how similar tragedies might be prevented. Alaska State Troopers handled the law enforcement investigation, while the Alaska Department of Fish and Game focused on wildlife behavior and management issues. Dr. Margaret Winters' behavioral analysis revealed that the bear had likely been in the Kotzebue area for several days before the attack, with unconfirmed sightings reported by residents who had assumed they were seeing large dogs or other domestic animals. The investigation identified several factors that might have attracted the bear to the community, including improperly secured garbage containers and the scent of traditional native foods being prepared for upcoming cultural celebrations. The timing of the attack, occurring during the school day when children would be walking home, highlighted the vulnerability of young people in Arctic communities, where encounters with dangerous wildlife represent a constant potential threat. School officials began immediate discussions about modified dismissal procedures and the possibility of providing transportation for students during periods when polar bear activity was reported in the area. Jason McCarthy remained in critical condition for 6 days following the attack, his survival requiring multiple surgical procedures and intensive medical support. His parents, Robert and Sarah, maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, while also making preparations for Lily's funeral and dealing with the overwhelming media attention that the incident had attracted. The story of the polar bear attack captured national and international attention, with news crews from major television networks arriving in Kotzebue to cover what many outlets described as a tragic symbol of climate change's impact on Arctic communities. The media attention, while bringing awareness to environmental issues affecting polar bear populations, also created additional stress for a community already struggling to process the loss of 2 children. Environmental groups seized upon the incident to highlight the connection between climate change, Arctic ice loss, and increasingly frequent encounters between polar bears and human communities. Organizations such as Polar Bears International and the World Wildlife Fund issued statements expressing sympathy for the McCarthy family, while also emphasizing the need for aggressive action to address the environmental factors that were driving hungry bears into contact with humans. However, Some community members and wildlife management officials expressed frustration with media coverage that they felt oversimplified the complex factors involved in the attack. Robert McCarthy, speaking through a family spokesperson, emphasized that while climate change represented a long-term threat to polar bear populations, the immediate cause of his children's deaths was a hungry predator that had lost its natural fear of humans. The funeral service for Lily Rose McCarthy was held on February 15th at the Kotzebue Lutheran Church, with over 1,200 people attending, including residents from surrounding villages and officials from state and federal agencies. The service, conducted in both English and Inupiaq, celebrated Lily's short life while also providing a forum for community members to express their grief and support for the surviving family members. Lily's casket, constructed by local carpenter William Octolick using traditional woodworking techniques passed down through generations of his family, was adorned with flowers flown in from Anchorage and traditional native decorations created by community elders. The 13-year-old's favorite possessions, including her collection of smooth beach stones and a diary filled with observations about Arctic wildlife, were buried with her in the cemetery overlooking Kotzebue Sound. Jason McCarthy's condition began to stabilize on February 16th, exactly 1 week after the attack, though his recovery would require months of additional medical treatment and rehabilitation. The teenager's first coherent conversation with his parents, occurring on February 18th, focused primarily on his sister and his memories of the attack, creating concerns among medical staff about the psychological trauma he had experienced. Dr. Amanda Foster, a pediatric psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, was brought in to work with Jason as he began the long process of psychological healing. Dr. Foster, based in Anchorage but with extensive experience working with Alaska Native communities, recognized that Jason's recovery would need to address not only the physical trauma of the attack, but also the complex grief associated with losing his sister while being unable to protect her. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond Jason and his immediate family, affecting the entire Kotzebue community, and particularly the children who attended school with the McCarthy siblings. School counselors reported increased anxiety among students, with many expressing fears about walking home and general concerns about their safety in the community. A memorial scholarship fund established in honor of Jason and Lily McCarthy raised over $127,000 in its first month, with contributions coming from across Alaska and from environmental organizations around the world. The fund, administered through the Northwest Arctic Borough School District, was designated to support educational opportunities for local students interested in studying wildlife biology, environmental science, or emergency medicine. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented several policy changes in response to the attack, including enhanced protocols for monitoring polar bear movements near communities and improved coordination between wildlife officials and local law enforcement agencies. The department also increased funding for community education programs designed to help residents identify and respond appropriately to dangerous wildlife encounters. Robert McCarthy returned to work on a limited basis in early March, though his role with the department was modified to reduce fieldwork and focus more on data analysis and policy development. His expertise in polar bear behavior, combined with his personal experience as an attack survivor's father, made him a valuable resource for developing improved safety protocols and community education programs. Sarah McCarthy took extended leave from her position at the health center to focus on Jason's recovery and her family's emotional healing. Her nursing background proved invaluable in managing Jason's complex medical needs as he transitioned from hospital care to outpatient treatment and eventual return to Kotzebue. The investigation into the attack was officially completed on April 15th, with multiple agencies releasing a comprehensive report that analyzed the incident from behavioral, environmental, and policy perspectives. The report confirmed that the bear's attack was motivated by extreme hunger and desperation, rather than territorial or defensive behavior, and that the animal's poor physical condition had contributed to its willingness to approach and attack humans. Dr. Winter's final report included 16 recommendations for reducing the risk of similar incidents in Arctic communities, ranging from improved garbage management and food storage practices to enhanced early warning systems for dangerous wildlife activity. Many of these recommendations were subsequently adopted by communities throughout the Arctic regions of Alaska and northern Canada. The broader implications of the Kotzebue attack extended well beyond wildlife management policy, contributing to ongoing debates about climate change, Arctic development, and the sustainability of human communities in regions where environmental changes were disrupting traditional ecological relationships. Scientists and policymakers recognized that similar incidents were likely to become more frequent as polar bears faced continued pressure from habitat loss and reduced hunting opportunities. Jason McCarthy returned to Kotzebue in late April 2024, nearly 2.5 months after the attack, though his full recovery would continue for many additional months. His homecoming was marked by a community celebration that balanced joy at his survival with continued grief for his sister's death. The teenager's physical scars, while extensive, were gradually healing, but the psychological impact of the attack continued to present significant challenges. His first day back at school, occurring in early May after extensive preparation by counselors and administrators, was carefully managed to minimize trauma triggers while allowing Jason to reconnect with his classmates and begin the process of returning to normal activities. Many of his fellow students had prepared cards, letters, and small gifts, creating an atmosphere of support that helped ease his transition back to community life. The playground where the attack occurred was closed immediately following the incident and remained closed for several months while community officials debated its future. Some residents argued for removing the equipment entirely, viewing the site as too traumatic for continued use, while others believed that maintaining the playground would honor the children's memory and prevent fear from dominating community decisions. The compromise solution, implemented in June 2024, involved relocating the playground equipment to a different site within the school grounds, while converting the original location into a memorial garden dedicated to Jason and Lily McCarthy. The garden, designed with input from community members and the McCarthy family, featured Arctic plants, stone pathways, and a bronze plaque commemorating the children's lives and the community's resilience. The polar bear population monitoring program in the Chukchi Sea region was significantly enhanced following the attack, with additional funding provided for GPS collar studies, aerial surveys, and community-based monitoring initiatives. These programs were designed to provide better early warning of polar bear movements toward human settlements, and to improve understanding of the environmental factors driving such behavior. Dr. Winters published her comprehensive analysis of the Kotzebue attack in the Journal of Wildlife Management in August 2024, contributing to the scientific understanding of polar bear behavior under extreme environmental stress. Her research became a reference point for wildlife managers dealing with similar challenges in Arctic communities throughout Alaska, northern Canada, and Greenland. The media attention surrounding the attack gradually diminished over the following months, but the incident continued to be referenced in discussions about climate change, wildlife management, and community safety in Arctic regions. Documentary filmmakers, book authors, and academic researchers contacted the McCarthy family and community members seeking to explore the deeper implications of the tragedy. The McCarthy family's decision to remain in Kotzebue, despite the trauma they had experienced, was viewed by many community members as a testament to their resilience and commitment to the Arctic community they had made their home. Robert's continued work with polar bear research took on additional personal meaning as he sought to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Jason's recovery continued throughout 2024, with gradual improvements in both his physical condition and psychological well-being. The teenager's interest in wildlife biology, initially expected to be diminished by his traumatic experience, actually intensified as he sought to understand the ecological and behavioral factors that had led to the attack. His unique perspective as a survivor began to inform his academic interests and career aspirations. The anniversary of the attack, February 9th, 2025, was marked by a community remembrance ceremony at the Memorial Garden, with residents gathering to honor Lily's memory and celebrate Jason's continued recovery. The ceremony included traditional Inupiaq elements, as well as contemporary memorial practices, reflecting the multicultural nature of the Kotzebue community. Elder Tommy Kowalski, now 79 years old, spoke again about the relationship between humans and polar bears in the Arctic, emphasizing both the tragedy of the children's deaths and the broader environmental challenges facing all Arctic life. His words provided continued cultural context for understanding the incident within the traditional knowledge systems of Alaska Native peoples. The ice is changing. The bears are changing. Our world is changing, Tommy said, his voice carrying across the Memorial Garden where community members stood in the February cold. But our love for our children, our care for each other, these things do not change. We remember Lily, we celebrate Jason, we protect our future. The long-term impact of the February 9th, 2024 polar bear attack continued to influence policy, research and community practices throughout the Arctic regions of North America. The incident served as a stark reminder of the complex challenges facing communities that exist at the intersection of human civilization and wild Arctic ecosystems, where climate change and environmental disruption were creating new and unpredictable dangers.